Hello and welcome to another edition of ideaXme. The writer and historian Sheila Rowbotham has been heavily involved in the feminist cause for many years. In her latest book, Daring to Hope, Sheila writes about her memories of the 1970s when the women's liberation movement in the UK really got underway. Sheila, before we go into that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in feminism in the first place?
It's a funny question because I wrote a book of memories about the 60s, and in that I was quite surprised looking back that it went, my interest, although it didn't have any focus, it was an interest that would pop up and then go down again. I was interested in thinking about being a woman in some different kind of way from really my early teens, I think. I think it was really because of education and the possibility of going on to university, which hadn't happened with anyone else in my family. And it began to really put me into a category of being very odd. And I was regarded as very odd. I was brought up in Leeds, and my friend from school's boyfriend told me I was one off, which I didn't know what it meant. And he said it's the thing that is wrong on the assembly line. So I was considered peculiar. And I then realized that there were little groups of us, mainly my women friends, but also one boyfriend of a friend at school called Tony Kay. And we were very self-consciously a bit unusual in the late 50s and early 60s, because it just wasn't usual for many women to go on into higher education and be reading books and holding forth on ideas and things at that time.
Now, 1970 saw Britain's first women's liberation conference, which you were involved in. How did that come about? What was the event like, and why was it significant?
Through 1969, we'd started to have little groups meeting to talk about our situation. And because we'd heard about the American movement that was several years ahead of us in organizing, we'd heard about consciousness raising groups. So we thought this would be good to talk about our personal feelings, because we didn't really have any theory about our situation. We just had bemused disgruntlement at a whole series of responses that we used to get from the men that we knew. And this didn't seem like politics at the time. It wasn't regarded as anything that was of any social significance. And in fact, men would say, this is just your individual feeling. So when we started to talk with one another in these small groups, which there was just really a handful in London that I could know of, but we began to realize that it wasn't just an individual predicament, that a lot of women who were similar to us, who were educated, middle class women, were worried about their predicament. They didn't fit in. And we started to wonder why that was. And we also noticed that there was developments going on with trade union women in Britain who were raising issues about equality, but they were also raising connections between themselves and people in South Africa who were suffering from apartheid. So there was an awareness of international rebellion, and that certainly affected young women like me. I had been a student and was doing a thesis, and in the universities there was a lot of support for movements like anti-apartheid and the opposition to the remains of colonial rule, which had been seething right through the 60s. So there was a sense of connection. We knew about the civil rights movement. And we also knew that Black Power had raised issues about how you were seen and regarded, and not only issues to do with material inequality.
So there was this kind of bubbling up of interest and discovery going on at the end of the 60s. And how did that then translate itself into action, into holding an event?
Really, again, we didn't think immediately of having a conference. It was a history workshop event. That was a radical history event at a trade union college in Oxford, where we expected to feel that we were in company that was on the same wavelength, because we supported the unions, the ones of us who were there. But the men who were the students thought it was very funny that when a dispute arose and we said we were going to have a meeting about women, and of course to them to have a meeting to talk about women was to talk about sex. So they all roared with laughter, and we were very angry. And a little tiny group of us got together in a student study room, and we thought initially of having a meeting about women's history. And then somebody said, well, we haven't, who was from America, called Barbara Winslow, she said, there hasn't been a general women's liberation meeting yet. And that should be the priority. And we agreed that was true. So we set about it, and we didn't know really who would come or how many people would come. And although estimates differ, what happened was around about 500 people came, mainly women, but also a group of men, some of whom looked after children in the creche. First we met in the trade union college, Ruskin, but there were too many of us, and we had to overflow into the student union, which was a very austere space, because at the time it was mainly students who would be the ones debating. And in fact, when I'd been a student there in the early 60s, women were not even allowed to be members of our own students' union. It was so archaic. But that had changed by the late 60s. So it was certainly true that women were admitted, but women, it wasn't a comfortable space, really. It's a long, thin room that we were speaking in. So we had to address people in a more rhetorical way, probably, than we would have been in normal meetings, little group meetings.
And this meeting was pretty significant, wasn't it? Or did you realize that at the time?
Yes, there was an electric atmosphere about it. Nobody really had any overall certainty about what it was that was coming into being. But we did know that the excitement and interest and originality of thought was something that was really special and unusual. There were some disagreements, but there was in general an atmosphere of people being prepared to listen to people who had different views from them. It was really, I think, the discussions that took place, not just the talks, which covered issues to do with women in the unions and equality and equal rights not been enough and things like that, as well as things like position of women prisoners. And a group talked about their personal feelings of rebellion, which had made them form a very, very early women's group, which was influenced by the writer Juliet Mitchell, who wrote an early article which was influential in the late 60s.
Did everyone agree on the definitions of phrases like women's liberation or feminism?
We tended to be quite suspicious of feminism. There were some women who came along who were from older group of equal rights feminists, but they were in a minority, and the majority of us were young women who used the term liberation because we saw that as transformation of society. And we also imagined that liberation of women would be interconnected with other forms of liberation in terms of issues around race and colonization and class, and also gay liberation, which had started to also develop groups.
So what were the goals, the dreams that came out of the conference?
Well, I think the excitement was of encountering so many women who seemed to be wanting to change society. That was extraordinary, because people like me were used to going to big conferences, which were mainly men, with women on the sidelines. And this time, the men were standing around looking a little awkward and not quite sure where to put themselves. They were obviously men who came to it, who supported what we were doing, but the energy and initiative was with young women mainly. And we just knew that we wanted to go on talking. But the demands that were put forward were coming out of ideas that were much more sober, so that we had basic equal rights demands actually that were put forward, that were issues that it was felt people would generally agree with. And those were later accepted at a big meeting in Sheffield a few months later. But those were for equal rights at work, and we wanted also the contraception, free contraception and abortion. We were talking about nurseries as well. And we wanted to assert the position of women who were in, working class women who were in a position that was more oppressive than the middle class women who were really taking the initiative at the conference. I mean, there were working class women there, but the impetus started from the middle class. And one exception actually was a trade union woman called Audrey Wise,
who later went on to become an MP.
She did. And while she was an MP, she was arrested by the police for demonstrating for women at Grunwicks, who later were organising in a picket, low-paid women of mainly Asian origin.
The way that conference was organised was really without anyone in charge.
We were absolutely determined because we were opposed to being silenced by voices of authority. We wanted it to be a collective experience in which individuals could develop through collective and mutual support.
You wanted to avoid hierarchies, didn't you?
Definitely, yes. I think that seems really incomprehensible now, because there's such an emphasis on figures and celebrities and leaders. But we thought that in order to release the potential in everybody, you needed to have a shared kind of initiative coming from people, so that you would strengthen every individual's confidence to be able to speak and to have put forward their ideas. I mean, in practice, it was uneven. It didn't always completely work. But the fact that so many women were able to overcome the hurdles and difficulties that they'd had before and emerge with confidence, I think it was something that we were able to pass on to a new generation, really, so that a new group of women would arise who just assumed that such things were possible.
And that seemed to have remained a feature of activities that took place in subsequent months and years, this non-hierarchical approach.
Yes, I mean, there was a critique developed showing that sometimes our emphasis on the small group and not having a structure could produce hidden leadership, because as nobody was responsible, some people would take the initiative because somebody had to start the meeting. And it was how we really struggled with, how do you take an initiative without imposing on others? And I think that by and large, we managed to do that for several years anyway, until really towards the end of the 70s, when very severe and strong differences appeared within women's liberation, and therefore it was hard to maintain that, really.
How did this movement differ from other movements or political forces, if you like, at the time?
I think it was similar in some ways to some groups in the 1960s who were influenced by anarchism and libertarian left ideas. So, for instance, there was a squatting movement that was around in the 60s, and there was
just to interrupt you there, squatting is taking over housing
that's empty, yes. Yes, well, that was very much going on in the early 70s, because a lot of housing had been, the councils were thinking they were going to demolish houses, and then they didn't demolish them, so they were left owned by the council, but they were kept empty. And people who had low incomes in the cities were able to live in the houses, and because of some ancient law, it was not easy to evict them. Actually, the state woke up to it and changed the law.
So there were quite a lot of grassroots movements happening in the 1970s and indeed in the 60s, and an exciting time.
People talked about do-it-yourself politics, which was a non-violent direct action. And I think some of the roots probably went back to the non-violent direct action of the campaign for nuclear disarmament with Committee of 100. But people, it's difficult to trace those roots, but that action was there in the memories of quite a lot of individuals who got involved in groups like women's liberation, gay liberation in the 70s, because it occurred in the 1960s.
There were some dramatic moments in women's liberation in that period. I mean, I'm thinking of the protests at the Miss World competition. Yes,
the Miss World competition came quite soon after the first Women's Liberation Conference, and it was really, I think it was quite difficult for people like me who were used to left and socialist ways of thinking to accept that imagery and the visual imagery in the body and how the body was portrayed was part of politics. And it was really the action that women took that demonstrated how much it was. At the time, it was often misunderstood and misinterpreted. So people thought, oh, these women in women's lib, as they called us, the media, oh, they're just, jealous of these other women's beauty. But quite a lot of women who were questioning already did understand what we were on about in a way that they probably wouldn't have done if people were just giving them a talk about the need for equality in abstract. It was the, films of there's been a feature film, and also there's a documentary that was on our television, which really demonstrates it was so kind of crass, the way in which the comedians like Bob Hope and the Mecca men talked about the women, that I think a lot of women began to see it through different eyes because of that demonstration. It was really important.
The Miss World protest was quite a high profile event, but you were also involved in quite a lot of activities that were perhaps less high profile. I'm thinking of trying to help cleaners who mostly worked at night.
Yes, and that was very non-high profile, because it meant plodding around the streets of the city with a friend of mine called Liz War. Every Tuesday night, we did it for 3 years, going up to cleaners who would be in a hurry trying to get to work, with carrying plastic bags with their tea in and their sandwich for the night. And it was around about 10 o'clock at night we had to go out, and the city is absolutely deserted, except for these women who we could very quickly tell, because they were sort of going to work at that time when everybody else had gone home. They were working through the night, and they were contract cleaners, so they didn't have any permanent employment. And it was very easy for the contract cleaning companies to get rid of them if they tried to organize. So without realizing it, really, we responded to one of the cleaners' requests for help. She was a remarkable woman called May Hobbs, who just felt that the conditions were so bad and the cleaners' voices were not heard. And she came to women in both women's liberation and in the socialist groups and said, can you help to go around and unionize women? And so we set off without much knowledge, and gradually learned how problematic it was. But without realizing, we'd actually stumbled into a form of work that was going to become much more prevalent as the decades went on, so that more and more people were employed in these casualized conditions. We had no idea that would happen. Unfortunately, it was actually the privatization had started with Harold Wilson, 1968, who the Labour Party had started it in the civil service. We started trying to organize with the Transport and General Workers Union, but it was very bureaucratic and completely mysterious, because they said, you've got to have a certain number of people before you can have a branch of your own. So now you're going to have to be with these window cleaners. And we could never find the window cleaners. They seemed to be paying dues, but we couldn't find them to ever, say, well, can we come and have a meeting with you window cleaners? No, they were never to be found. So that was a very confusing situation, because we didn't understand the bureaucracy of the union at all. And the union thought we were a complete pain, because we expected the union officials to quite happily come out at about 1 o'clock in the morning to have discussions with the women when they had their break from their work. And the union officials were sort of guys who just, elderly guys, they didn't want to come out at 1 o'clock in the morning to talk to these little groups of women. And there's endless hoo-has about that. And then eventually we made contact. May Hobbs got in contact with the Civil Service Union, and the Civil Service Union were quite pleased to come and help and organize, because there's some younger guy and he was quite happy to do all this. And the cleaners, when they went on strike, I think they got £10 a week. And I think they were only getting, they were getting about that for their wages. So they were very happy to be on the picket line.
So were the strikes successful?
Yes, they were successful, but the problem was that we couldn't maintain those increases because if the building changed the contractor, by British law, the agreement was no longer valid. So that was a really big problem. And I think it's very interesting now because some younger people now have started with quite good success organizing cleaners, for example, in the NHS. And they have been able to overcome many of the problems that we encountered and couldn't overcome. We did carry on, say, for about 3 years, but then it just, I gave up. I found that I'd been by mistake trying to recruit a group of cleaners to the civil service union because Maid said go to this building, and then I realized that they couldn't be covered by the civil service. So I took all the money I'd taken from them out of my account and gave it back in little envelopes. And I was incredibly apologetic because I felt as though I'd taken their money by fraud. And they were really happy because it was near Christmas and they didn't bother about the fact that I'd been taking this money and I'd got them in the wrong union. I gave it back like a little, I think it was like the turkey money, when you get the money that you've saved over the last few months to buy your turkey with.
So, that was one of many campaigns that you were involved with. At the same time, you were also writing a number of books about history, particularly relating to women. Was there any kind of feedback loop between the actions, the activities you were getting involved in and what you were writing about?
Yes. The first book I did was very early on, Women, Resistance and Revolution, and it covered events in Britain, but it did also look at other countries, including China, what was then the Soviet Union, and I also wrote about movements in Algeria. It was very difficult to find much material on countries, like Algeria, but there were 2 really good books that I used. And I was using mainly secondary sources, although for the European history, I did draw on documents and newspapers. And I found wonderful newspapers in London from the 1848 revolution in France, where the women had produced amazingly. It's produced these newspapers and had said so many things that were completely similar to what we were saying. And it was a great revelation to me to read that. So it was, and it was 2 ways. It was me looking for things and then realizing that a lot had been said that was similar in many ways to what we were saying. And I think at that time, we only really knew much about the suffrage movement, which was for a particular demand. But then I realized that women had been involved in movements around issues to do with consumption, as well as early trade unions, and also even in these revolutionary movements like the Commune and the 1848 revolution in France.
So the activities you were taking part in were kind of helping to illuminate the history that you were writing about in some way.
Yes, I think it made me ask lots of questions that I hadn't asked when I was a student. I just assumed that the history I got was kind of history. Very rarely would women appear. And that was partly because it was mainly about the history of leading male politicians. And so as history began to be questioned by people on the left, because there were left-wing historians who were looking at society and movements from below. That opened up the question of, well, where were women in all this? I mean, you knew that the women weren't there in the leading positions in the state, but women were obviously there in society and daily life. So you began to think, because that area was coming into history, it made it possible to think there's an absence here.
You also write about the challenge of balancing, I don't know if that's the right word, the personal and the political.
Yes.
I mean, how did that kind of play out for you?
Well, that idea of transforming oneself as well as changing society had come to us without, I don't think we were that aware, but it came from the American New Left, who had been struggling against McCarthyism in the States. So they felt you had to have some kind of personal link to your politics, because otherwise the politics also, they thought, could end up like the Soviet Union, in which, in the name of socialism and communism, really horrific acts had taken place. So the group of people on the New Left who tried to distinguish themselves from what had happened in the former Soviet Union were open to talking about the links between personal behavior and attitudes. And when the women's liberation movement developed in America, the American women took over those ideas and said, you know, if the personal is political, we've got to think about our personal relationships, including our sexuality. And so people like me were interested in having changes in how we related personally, because it was quite possible to be critical of society and yet defer to men, because men tended to be the people who said how things should be done. So it was an idea that began to extend into our lives with men for heterosexual women, but it was also for people who were attracted to people of same sex an issue, because they also wanted to have more equal relationships too. So there was the idea that you would be trying to democratize not only society in the fullest sense, but also your own personal relating. And part of that was to get rid of jealousy and ownership, which I think, well, I say in the book, really, I think what we did was to reduce some of it, because there was such an emphasis in the culture on possession and ownership and jealousy. We wanted that to be much less, and we tried to make it much less. I think it was possible as long as people weren't really threatened. As soon as people were really threatened, then those reactions really kicked in again. So we never solved that, how you deal with loss and desertion and abandonment. But we did, I think, try to make it so that there wasn't that idea of, you know, male control over women's sexuality.
Would it be fair to say that you might, at the time, have viewed marriage as a bit like that it had kind of overtones of ownership in it?
Well, I think that the Americans, they had a group which was, the acronym was WITCH, and one of the first things they did was to go off with their weapons, which were white mice, to disrupt the American bridal fairs that were the great big sort of commercial events. And so they were taking this sort of non-violent direct action. But on the other hand, they then started to rethink. A friend of mine called Rose Baxendale had been part of that group. They thought, this is not very good because this is attacking other women. who want to have their white dresses and their bridal outfits. And so there is a dilemma in that problem, I think, because those of us who weren't married would be critical of marriage. On the other hand, we didn't criticize friends who were married or who stayed married, or, you know, because the idea really in the early days of women's liberation was for women to choose how they should live and to have the choice over their lives. So if women had the choice over their lives to get married, we didn't really attack that, or at least not the people that I was connected to. I think perhaps some people might have done better. We didn't have a sort of anarchist total condemnation of people for getting married. After a certain point, it just ceased to be an issue. So many other people weren't getting married anyway.
In your memoirs, you also write about a fair amount about what was going on in your personal life, and there's this interesting word duogamy comes up, which I think today has taken on a different meaning.
Has it?
But yes, was that just a term that you coined? Or?
I invented this word. I didn't know any other people used it. It happened in my life because I was in a relationship with David Widgery, and we were really well suited in a lot of ways. But I met another man called Paul Atkinson after a few years being with David, and I really fell passionately in love with Paul, and I didn't feel it seemed inconceivable to leave David, and I couldn't give up Paul. And so it was a kind of empirical situation. It wasn't a kind of, I am now going to have a relationship with two men. It was because the circumstances arose. So that was how that happened. And other people also seemed to get into that situation around about the same time. But I didn't know that there were, in America, for example, people quite consciously experimenting in communities who did feel that you should not have any sexual possession. There were some libertarian people who tried to break down individual relationships, but those things were, it was when those extremes of trying to change personal behavior usually ended up with people just breaking up. The whole group would break up, and I mean, I think the extreme attempts to change patterns of human activity didn't work at all in that way. But for quite a few years, I did have a relationship with both David Widgery and with Paul Atkinson.
You mentioned just now extremism. The women's liberation movement was quite a broad church and contained people with a lot of different views. And there were some women who favoured really not having any contact with men.
From the early 70s, a group, the radical feminists, felt that some of them felt they didn't want to be in relationships with men. So they gave up sexual relationships, but they tended to live in mainly with other women. But then some other radical feminists did live with men. So it's, it wasn't an absolute thing. And it was more the late 70s when those divisions came up in a very extreme way, because one group of women said that men were inherently violent and that, basically men couldn't change. And other people like me, who were socialist feminists, felt that you couldn't say of any group of people that group of people can never change just because they were born in a particular way, because that meant that you would be cutting off the possibility of changing how people perceived things and how people saw things and how they felt. So we disagreed with that, with those views. I think one of the difficulties of having this thing of trying not to have just single person one-to-one relationships was that when you had a child, that there are certain complications that come if the child doesn't know who the father is. And so I was kind of conservative on that issue. I thought that children ought to know who their fathers were, because we were also arguing it was very important for fathers and indeed for non-biological parents to help in raising children, because we thought that the family could be such a tiny, sort of intense and oppressive group. We wanted to extend it to a larger group of people. What happened really was that when women started to join women's liberation groups, the fact that the men were not participating, looking after the children or doing housework, became an issue of conflict, because people were saying, as women, we don't want to carry on doing these things that has just been expected of us, that we do the domestic work and look after the children. And in that kind of context, ideas about the nuclear family being oppressive were raised, so that people were saying the family is really repressive. But at the same time, it became evident that any one thing is never the total truth, I think, that the family could be oppressive, but it could also be a really important source of support. And I think that was one of the reasons why a lot of working class women were very dubious about women's liberation, middle class women attacking the family. And through the process of discussion, I think the realization came that the family is both. It's rather like the state, that the state is also something that can be oppressive, it can be coercive, but at the same time, the state can provide welfare and is a valuable source of support, particularly for any vulnerable group or people who are dependent and can't earn an individual wage, like women who are looking after children. So that notion that the family was both a support and a source of subordination and oppression began to come together as something that was more complex as an understanding about the family. But we did want to extend beyond the individual couple to go to a larger group, rather in the way that people had a larger group before, really, when there had been kinship networks that had looked after children as well. And non-biological parents in houses did get involved with looking after the children, and the relationships and connections and closeness has continued. You know, now the children are in their 40s or 50s.
Going back to the conference in 1970, you said it was, you know, a lot of young women, perhaps predominantly from middle-class backgrounds, involved at the start. But as the 70s went on, you started to reach out and connect with a very wide range of women from other backgrounds. How were these ideas received by different groups?
Initially, the Black women's groups were more concerned about race. And within that, they were beginning to also talk about gender in the very early 70s. And those groups were also very much engaged with issues about the state and the way the state, in the shape of the police, were intervening in the lives of Black communities, particularly, of course, against young Black men. The white women's liberation, as we recalled, was also actually concerned about those kinds of issues, but we were more removed from them because it was not necessarily our own families. Whereas, for example, my son went to what was called a community nursery, which was set up as a self-help nursery, and then gradually got funding from the local state. And the one of the workers there was a black nursery worker who was of Caribbean origin, and her son was brought up in Hackney. And he, in one of the times when there were various uprisings in the city, went out to see what was going on, and was actually just standing at the doorstep, and was grabbed by the police. So although these issues were not directly affecting us, they were very, very close to us if we lived in inner city areas which were both white and black, because we got involved in lots of community projects because we were concerned about nurseries, and we were concerned about things like adventure playgrounds and things that we were campaigning about around. We were also campaigning on abortion and free contraception, and also supporting women in trade unions. So in all those ways, there were large numbers of women who were from both South Asia and also from the Caribbean, who were doing those kinds of jobs. So we had a contact, and were aware of those issues as well.
Those women from those groups, how did they react? Did they take on what you and your colleagues were telling them?
Well, some women became very active because they were involved in issues around policing and immigration. But I don't think that they didn't necessarily, the things that we were going on about, I don't think they saw all of those as being particularly relevant to them, because they had somewhat different concerns. I had a neighbour called Barbara Marsh, who I kept in contact with through the 60s and 70s, and she was a very staunch Catholic, so she never agreed about abortion rights. She came from Jamaica, and she was very conscious about issues to do with women and class and race, because she experienced racism when she came to Britain. But she never would have gone to a women's liberation group, although she did. She was an active trade unionist, but she used to talk about all these things.
Looking back on the 70s now, how does it seem to you? What were the highs and lows, if you like?
We often thought things were very bad in the 70s, but given what's happened subsequently, when I look back, I mean, a lot of the things don't seem that bad. I mean, there was a lot of poverty, and there was still really bad housing. There were problems that people had renting, but these problems didn't go away, and in some ways, there's still very much live issues that women are facing as well as men. I don't remember such issues to do with sexual aggression that seems to be now being reported in schools. I mean, I taught in schools.
Is that possibly because people were more reticent about talking about those sorts of issues in the 70s, and that the prevalence was just as great then as it is reported to be today?
Yes. I think it was perhaps so hidden that people didn't express some of the things that now people would be putting in on social media and things. But I'm not very good at talking about social media, as I don't have anything to do with it. I find it difficult enough to cope with listening to the news on the radio and doing my email.
But just going back to the 70s for a moment, there was one thing that comes across quite strongly from reading your memoirs is this sense of excitement and purpose, at least in the beginning years of the 70s. And what do you think had changed by the end of the decade?
Well, there were real splits, and therefore the atmosphere at very big conferences wasn't so good. But it didn't stop people carrying on. I mean, we carried on having, campaigns and discussing the situation of women. It just was that it goes off into lots of different streams. And I think also people got involved in all kinds of cultural groups. There were, women photographers and designers, and they were raising a lot of things that were about how women were represented. So it wasn't that things just came to a complete halt. It was that we didn't have anything that was vaguely there as a general collective movement. But it wasn't the end of interest in feminism and women's emancipation and liberation. And indeed, in the 80s, those issues went into different places, influencing things like local government, for example. I think really what happens is that the things that had been coming up from below start to become part of institutions. So the women's studies develops and gets much more of a force from the 1980s. And also an impact's made in the trade unions, and also women of Asian descent and women of Afro-Caribbean descent and African descent are much more of a force from the 1980s in society than they had been in the earlier period. There are also more people who are brought up from those backgrounds who are actually brought up in Britain, and they are much more confident than their parents who were trying to make a living in difficult circumstances, having come from other places. So the ones who were brought up in Britain were much more likely to have ideas of what sorts of changes they needed and articulate them. So there were kind of new things that happened in the 80s. And there's also the really powerful movement of Greenham, of the women arguing against the basis and also insisting on the women's participation in the peace movement.
This was the protests at Greenham Common in the 1980s by women against the installation of nuclear-armed cruise missiles here in the UK.
Yes. And I mean, I was thinking about what happened subsequently. I went to teach at Manchester University from the mid-90s. I got my first job in my 50s, but late. But that was my first full-time job. I had students of different waves of, coming through. There were people who were part of the movement about environment and animal rights, who, when I first went there were people who were influenced by ecological movements, of which we were not that aware about environmental issues and ecological issues in the 1970s. It was sort of there, but very much on the periphery, whereas it starts to, in the 90s, to really become much more to the fore. And young people were defending trees and the environment. So there's that kind of, again, the same ideas of nonviolent direct action. And I can remember meeting a young man, I can't remember the precise date, it would probably be the early 2000s or late 1990s, who really was mobilizing, I think, in the Southwest and in a town, and he'd sort of circulated he'd sent things out to every household in the town about some issue to do with the environment. And he also talked about this way of organizing, you know, not having leaders and things. And I thought, oh, well, perhaps he's influenced by, you know, the ideas that we had in the early 70s. And I said to him, well, where did you get these ideas? And he said, well, Buddhism. So that was kind of completely amazing to me, that he didn't get them from any left politics or feminism or anything. He got it from Buddhism. So I don't think that the movement's ever stopped. There was then Seattle, the protests at Seattle, and students who in the 2000s were campaigning against the World Trade Organization because of the globalized nature of capitalism. And a lot of women's movements in many parts of the country, many countries, are very much concerned about resources and access to resources and material issues that are really basic, which have been threatened because of either the action of very large companies or because of the changes in the environment that's been caused by global industrialization.
So what would you say your hopes and maybe your fears are today for the future?
Well, I guess I'm always kind of moderately optimistic. And I have to say that in the very recent times, the news is so terrible that I think it's impossible to have any kind of easy optimism about prospects of what can be done. But I mean, the main issues are not that different. It's still, I think that capitalism is still a very wasteful system. It's a very unjust system and a very unequal system. And it's very difficult to make small changes even in it. And sometimes the small changes are made and then they get reversed. My big hope would be of a global transformation of capitalism. My smaller hope would be that at least some kind of basic social and economic reforms could be done in particular places, which would lessen the waste in human potential. And I think along with that would be the importance of trying to contest the ways in which values that of competition and inequality, which have become absolutely deep-seated in our society, and the acceptance that the power of the market has to be something that is how we judge how we organize our society. That is extended, and I think we need to push that back. And I don't think any one group is ever going to be able to do that. So it means making links and coalitions and connections beyond any particular group in order to try to at least start pushing back into the ground that's really been taken. I mean, the capitalism that we were contesting in the 70s was more social because of the struggles that people had had in the past than the capitalism that we face now, in which many of those forces, like the trade unions in the countries like Britain, who did stand for broader things than simply just increases in wages. They had social values behind them of solidarity and connection to others. They've been made less powerful. So the need is to have other kinds of ways of organizing to complement the older ones. But I don't know what those would be.
Leave that to the next generation.
I know, because to tell you the truth, I mean, I'll be 80 in 2 years' time. So, well, about 1.5 years' time. And I do notice that I just get more tired and everything seems to take me longer time now. So I hope younger people will, I mean, obviously people with my age want to help, but we have got a bit older now, so we can't completely do the same things we used to do.
Sheila Rowbotham, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us on this episode of the ideaXme show. Our mission is to move the human story forward by sharing knowledge of the future. You can find us across the internet on all the major audio podcasting networks at www.radioideaXme.com, YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe